I think for me, writing has a lot to do again with stories. Like I think
Yeah.
centrally, I'm interested in what are the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, about who other people are, and what stories sort of, in what ways do the stories that we have available to us like limit our ability to imagine different futures for ourselves or open up possibilities.
Guys, I'm super excited to introduce you to Chris Stedman. Chris is a writer, activist, and professor who teaches in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Augsburg University in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His latest book, IRL, was actually put on my radar by Cynthia Berg, my good friend who's helping me with Ripple. And she suggested I read it because she thought there was so much synergy between what Chris is talking about within his book and what we talk about through the Ripple, which is authenticity, putting your best foot forward, finding your tribe that accepts you for who you are, no matter who or what you are. And this was a really, really powerful book. It was a real page turner. I really loved reading it. He's also the author of his first book, which was Faitheist. I have not read that book yet, but I look forward to reading it. And he's also the creator and host of a limited series podcast called Unread. Let me just say, if you get into this podcast, you will be hooked. Uh, Sometimes it's a dark and somewhat sad look behind the scenes of online relationships, how they develop personas and approaches to how we conduct ourselves online. And it's a story that will keep you intrigued, I promise you. And something I highly encourage you to check out. That's called Unread. You can find it on almost every podcast platform. So I'm super excited to have Chris join the show today. And I've got tons of questions. I'm looking forward to this. So let's dive in. Guys, welcome to the Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm super excited to have Chris Stedman with me today. Chris, welcome to the Ripple Effect Podcast. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing good. Although it's a little chilly here, but not nearly as chilly as where you are.
Yeah, we just got a huge amount of snow a couple days ago, so it officially feels like winter here.
Winter is there, huh?
Hmm.
So, you guys will have warmer weather in what, 6, 7 months, maybe?
Yeah, this is the time of year where you just sort of buckle down and and get ready for a long winter. Yes.
Yeah. Well, so the friend that actually put your book in front of me actually lives in St. Paul. So I
Oh.
get to hear from her like once a week about just how horrible the weather is. And it's coming into the worst time of year for her.
It is, yeah. Yeah, I kind of like December. I'm a bit of a Christmas fan. I like all the
Yeah.
lights and, all that stuff. But January things start to get a little bleak. You got to find January is like when I have to be a little bit intentional about, looking for the good in the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
May will be here eventually, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Well, listen, as we dive in, one of the things I like to do on this podcast is before we like talk about the book and talk about, sort of where your energies are focused now. I like to give our audience just a little bit of your origin story because I'm kind of like a comic book nerd. So I always like to know, whom, what went into the, making the hero. And so could you give our audience a little bit about, who Chris Stedman is and sort of where you came from and kind of how you, what you do at this point today?
Sure, yeah. So I am from Minnesota, grew up here. I left for the better part of a decade, but returned in 2017. All my family's here. My stepdad has Alzheimer's, and so that was part of why I came back, was to be closer to family, to help out with family. But yeah, I I teach religion, and that's sort of part of my day job. I'm a professor at a university here in Minneapolis called Augsburg. It's a Lutheran affiliated university. And then I'm a writer, and writing is kind of my main thing. I teach, if you can believe it, for fun. um, but my interest in religion, I can trace back to my childhood, which might be confusing because I actually was not raised religious. So
Hmm.
religion wasn't a part of my life growing up. It wasn't something that I really had much of an understanding of at all. But I started to become sort of interested in it. Well, really in third grade, we moved to a new neighborhood where there was a kid my same age who was being raised in a multi-faith household. So
Oh.
her mom was Jewish, her dad was Catholic. She was kind of encouraged to, seek and sort of, pursue whatever resonated with her most. which ended up being Judaism. And I was invited to, come join her family for some holidays, and that was kind of the first time when I became aware of religion. And I don't know, I saw that she was like a part of this bigger story, that she had this community she was a part of, this way of talking about, meaning and values. And I kind of looked at my own life and was like, what is our story? Like,
Yeah.
what do we believe? But I was in third grade. So my curiosity sort of only lasted so long before I
Yeah.
was on to the next thing. Um, but eventually, my interest in religion, or my curiosity about it, returned when I was an adolescent, and I was invited to this after school youth group by some friends. And, looking back on it, I ended up getting really involved in this community. But it's clear to me now, sort of in hindsight, that it's because it met these two really foundational needs that I have, and that I think we all have, which is the need for a sense of meaning. We need to feel like
Yep.
our lives matter. Otherwise, why get out of bed in the morning?
Yep.
And then secondarily, the need for belonging, to feel like we
Yep.
have a place in the world where we fit. And, I think when we think about our needs as human beings, we tend to go straight to the physical. We think about
Yeah.
food, water, shelter, and those are all things we do need to survive. But we also can't live without meaning and without
Yep.
a sense of belonging. And that community really provided those things for me. So, long story short, eventually I went, by the time I decided to go to college, I wanted to study religion. And, my sort of journey in and out of religion has really been sort of centrally about trying to understand questions about, what makes for a meaningful life. How do we sort of find a place in the world where we can, have a story that helps us understand, how we should relate to the world around us. And so, even though at this point in my life, I don't consider myself religious, I think that those questions are super important. And I think everyone needs to wrestle with them in one way or another. And so today I teach a class at this Lutheran university on the search for meaning. And it's really interesting because the majority of our students at this university are not Lutheran. We have twice as many
Oh, wow.
Muslim students as we have Lutheran students. We have three times as many students who say they're not religious at all. And yet, all students have to take two religion classes on the search for meaning. And I think I consider it such a sort of privilege to put these questions before these students. Because again, I think whether you're religious, whether you're not, these are questions that we all need to kind of wrestle with throughout our lives.
Yeah.
And I think oftentimes people think, maybe if I don't think I'm religious, or I don't know where I fit religiously, those questions aren't for me. And I think everyone should have the opportunity to kind of think about those things, to ask themselves what makes for a meaningful life. And so, yeah, it's something I really enjoy doing. And in my
That's
writing,
awesome.
I try to explore those kinds of questions too.
Well, yeah, and I definitely want to talk about your writing because I finished IRL and I loved it. It was
Thank
a
you.
phenomenal book. But let me ask you. I mean, since we'll dive right into it, but any revelations in terms of your own life, in terms of what you've sort of assigned to the meaning of what your path and journey is?
Yeah. Well, IRL really came about because again, I'm very interested in where people find meaning in their lives and what kinds of spaces they're sort of wrestling with these questions. And I started to notice in my work, I worked at Harvard and at Yale as a humanist community leader. So at Harvard, for example, I was a chaplain. There are Catholic chaplains at Harvard, Muslim chaplains, Zoroastrian chaplains, and then there are humanist chaplains, which are for basically anyone who doesn't sort of pick a religious category. So I was kind of a catch-all chaplain. So I had atheist students, agnostic students, but also, spiritual but not religious, or seeking, or those kinds of things. And, again, for the better part of a decade, I was doing that work. And I started to notice more and more that a lot of people, especially younger people, were leaving the kinds of institutions where historically we've wrestled with questions of meaning and purpose, like
Yep.
religious spaces. And we're kind of taking that work to other spaces, particularly the internet.
Right.
That, one time, if you had a big question about how you should live your life, or how to make sense of tragedy or loss, you would often go to a religious space for those
Yeah.
things. Now, people go to Google.
Yeah.
And I wanted to understand how this shift from a sort of institutional way of meaning making to a more individual digital way was sort of impacting our understanding of what a meaningful life is and what it means to be human. And, for me, I don't consider myself religious, but I also find that the longer I explore these things, the longer I live life and experience all of the highs and the lows of
Yeah.
life, the more I just don't know. um, when I was young, I thought, oh, as you get older, you become more and more knowledgeable. You
Yeah.
learn more and more, and that is true. I definitely am more knowledgeable than I was when I was 13, but I also just, again, with each year, feel like I recognize more and more just how much I don't know, how much is kind of beyond my ability to understand, or at least to definitively make some kind of claim about. And so I'd say that I'm on, and probably always will be on a journey.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself pretty much a seeker at this point then?
Yeah, I mean, so in my class we talk about the sort of four different positions that a person can take on the existence of God. This is going to get a little bit in the weeds here, but I promise it's worth it.
Yeah.
So essentially, when it comes to the question of whether or not there's a higher power, or a single God or multiple gods, there are basically four big kind of categories that people fall into, and those are agnostic atheist, gnostic atheist with a Gnostic, uh, agnostic theist, and gnostic theist. So
Hmm.
basically, an agnostic atheist, which is what I consider myself, is someone who says, I can't prove that there isn't a God. I can't say with certainty that there isn't, but my sort of working theory, my best guess based on the available information, what I've experienced, what I perceive in the world, my sort of you know, studies, etc. I think that there probably isn't. And that's how I live. I live as if there isn't a God. I don't expect a higher power to have any kind of influence in my life, but I also recognize that there's a lot I don't know. I could be wrong. I'm open to new information, etc. Whereas a Gnostic atheist is someone who says, no, we can pretty definitively say there isn't, and they'll sort of make their argument for how there couldn't be a God. Likewise, an agnostic theist says, I don't know for sure, but I believe that there is a God. And, that's based on my studies, what I perceived, what I perceive in the world, etc. And an Gnostic theist says, they know with certainty that there is. And I think we all kind of fall into one of these or the other. We all either live as if there's a higher power or as if there isn't. We expect a higher power to have some kind of impact on the world, or we don't. But, so either we're all kind of living one of those ways. But the sort of other side of the quadrant has to do with certainty. So, how sure are you about kind of what your position is? And for me, I am, again, pretty agnostic about it. I think it's something that, again, I feel like the more we learn about the nature of the universe, the more confounding things become.
Yeah.
Once you get into quarks and all that stuff, it's like, how does this work?
Yeah.
And so, and I am just a very simple person.
Yeah.
There's a lot that I don't understand. And so I absolutely acknowledge that I could be wrong about that. But, I consider myself, I teach at a Lutheran university. So this is kind of the influence of that. But I consider myself a Bonhoeffer atheist. So if anyone doesn't know who Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, he was a Lutheran theologian. He lived in Germany at the time of the rise of the Nazis. And he believed that Christians have a responsibility to live as if there is no God, by which he meant Christians shouldn't expect God to intervene in the face of injustice, but rather they should act on God's behalf in the world. And for him, that meant attempting to assassinate Hitler, which is ultimately why he was imprisoned.
Yeah.
So he took that very seriously. And, I feel like in many ways I live exactly as Bonhoeffer suggested. I just maybe take it like one little step further
Yeah.
than he had in mind. But in many ways, whether I have very good friends, both my colleagues who I teach with, dear friends of mine who have really different positions on that question. For me, I'm less concerned about whether or not someone believes exactly as I do. I'm more concerned about, what do we see as our responsibility to one another and to the world around us? And if you believe that we have a responsibility to, try to build as just of a world as we can, to be there for our friends and neighbors. If your motivations are theological and mine are not, it doesn't really matter to
Yeah.
me as long as we
Yeah.
can sort of meet in those shared values.
Yep.
So for me, that's what's truly important. But yeah, so I am a seeker, but I also, I've sort of, for I would say, since I started studying religion academically and realized I didn't consider myself a Christian, I've been pretty much in the agnostic atheist camp ever since.
Yeah. But open. I mean, yeah, it's
Totally. Totally. And again, like, I could point you in the direction of 20 good friends who are, really sincere believers who I would say are way smarter than me. So I definitely don't think that I for sure have it right. That's kind of
yeah.
just based on my own experiences and my own, studies. That's kind of where I've landed. But, ask me again in 10 years, I might have a totally different
Could
answer
be
for you.
different. Yeah. Well, and it's kind of funny. I mean, you touched on this, right? At the end of the day, some people we end up going down a certain lane, or categorize ourselves in certain capacities. And you actually kind of touch on this in the book, right? In terms of how we represent ourselves online and offline. We'll get into that, but we have this tendency that well. I grew up Episcopalian, right? That's what I became as an adult because that's what I was as a kid, and
Hmm.
we fall into these habits of sort of what was socially normalized within our our own communities, our own family lives, and sometimes that's not always a good thing, right? Because you get so myopic in terms of your view and approach, and we get a little complacent and lazy, and we're not asking those higher level questions. We're not looking for more information or additional inputs.
Yeah. I mean, I could see a million different paths my life could have taken if I had started in a different place.
Yeah,
For example, a majority of Jewish people in the United States say there's no conflict between not believing in God and being Jewish. You can be Jewish and be an atheist, and that's fine, because they recognize that religion is about more than just a particular belief. It's about culture, it's about community, it's about a bigger story that you're a part of. And so, had I grown up Jewish, maybe I would still be Jewish.
yeah,
And, likewise, like, I think it's not a coincidence that I ended up back at being not religious because that's how I was raised.
yeah,
And so I think we like to think that we reason our way into our beliefs, but so often what we believe is deeply shaped by the experiences we have had or haven't had.
yeah,
And I have really tried throughout my life, and this is, as you sort of suggest, part of what I talk about in IRL. I've tried to kind of live more and more expansively, to expose myself to a broader number of stories and experiences beyond just what I will ever experience based on my own sort of narrow limitations of my identities, my background, etc. And the internet's been a huge part of that. It's
yeah.
enabled me to connect with people who have had vastly different experiences and stories. And those really expand, my own understanding of the world, and help me see beyond the sort of narrow horizons of my own experiences.
Yeah, that's great. Well, let me ask you a question. So, like, how did you, decide that, hey, I want to become a writer? I sort of have a little understanding of this, but my audience who
Sure.
hasn't read the book doesn't really have a clear appreciation for it. But what was the motivation for saying, hey, this is the career path I went? Because as you explain, I think even in your podcast, like that chosen direction was not an easy one, at least initially, right? So, but now you're very well known, and you've been able to create this platform and gain this notoriety for your work, and it's a really fascinating story. So
Thanks. Yeah, well, I've always loved writing, but I don't know. When I was young, I thought it wasn't really a viable career. Um, so somehow I ended up studying religion instead. That totally makes sense. um, but and I think for me, writing has a lot to do again with stories. Like, I think
yeah,
centrally, I'm interested in what are the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, about who other people are, and what stories sort of, in what ways do the stories that we have available to us, like, limit our ability to imagine different futures for ourselves, or open up possibilities. And so for me, like, when I was an adolescent, it was stories really that first kind of got me interested in the questions of religion. I was reading books like Alex Haley's Roots, John Hersey's Hiroshima, Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. So these were books that, detail some of the greatest atrocities in human history, but they also do it in a way where they're sort of telling the stories of people who experienced those things. So like I had learned about the Holocaust, I had learned about the atomic bomb droppings on Japan in school, but they were really just presented as these like historical events. Here are
Yep.
things that happened. But reading the stories filled me with a desire to understand, what does it say about human nature that we can be so cruel to one another? And ultimately, that's sort of what led me into religion. But, it was really those stories that kind of expanded my horizons, that invited my curiosity and empathy. And, you know, as I was coming out as a queer person, it was stories really that played a critical role in helping me imagine a future for myself because I didn't see any LGBTQ people around me. I felt like I didn't know sort of like how to. I saw, a lot of people like my mother, for example, is heterosexual, and so I was able to see how she could live her life, but I didn't see how like as a gay man what my life could be like
Yeah.
until I encountered the stories of other queer people. And so stories again really are very powerful, and ultimately that's my interest as a writer, is in telling stories that help kind of expand what we can see as possible for ourselves. The story that I tell in my podcast Unread is about the death of one of my closest friends who
Yeah.
died by suicide. And one of the reasons I decided to tell that story was because there's so much silence and shame around suicide and
Yep.
suicide loss. And when I lost my friend Alex, I was looking for stories, just like I did when I was an adolescent, looking for sort of LGBTQ stories. I was looking for stories of people who had navigated suicide loss to maybe help me imagine how I could navigate that experience myself. And I just
Yeah.
wasn't finding much. And so, that was a part of why I wanted to tell that story. But,
And
in
you do
terms
it
of,
beautifully, by the way.
oh,
I mean,
thanks.
I mentioned it in the intro, but all you have to do is listen to the small snippet intro episode, and you're hooked because you want to know what's going on because it 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 was sad, it was intriguing, and it felt like there was just so much more that you could pull out of that story, and a lot of lessons to be learned across the board.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. I appreciate that. And, yeah, I mean, if I had to identify kind of the point when I first began to imagine like I could be a writer, or maybe that's something I might want to pursue, it was honestly in first grade. And I have to give all the credit to my first grade teacher who took a really unconventional approach to teaching. Um, to this day, still, I would say like when I think about the teachers, the adults, whatever that influenced me as an adult or as a child, truly he is one of the first people that comes to mind. And we had this poetry unit where we had to turn in our sort of student notebook with I think like 3 or 4 poems in it. And I turned in my notebook and it had poems like on every page, front and back, the whole notebook. I had loved writing poems. So my teacher saw this and he was like, wow, this kid like loves poetry. And so
Not just for extra credit. This is
no,
genuine love, right?
no, there was no extra credit. I just couldn't stop writing poems.
That's
And
awesome.
so he, said to me like, "Hey, you love this. Like, would you like to sort of self-publish a book, like a book of poems? I'll help you with it." So
Wow.
he like we went through them. We picked out the sort of best ones. He, typed them up in his computer, laid them out on the page. We sort of bound them with like laminated construction paper covers. He made sure that each library in this elementary school library in the district had a copy. We had like a release
That's
party in the
awesome.
school library. He really, went out of his way to say, this is something that you're passionate about, and I want to help you sort of imagine yourself doing this.
Yeah.
And when I think about how I've ended up as a writer, it was, that teacher and then other people in the time since who have sort of, said to me, I see something in you, and validated that. And so I always try to remember that with my own students or just with the people in my life in general, to kind of name the gifts that I see and encourage them to pursue them, because that made all the difference for me.
That's amazing. Have you stayed in contact with that first grade teacher by chance?
Yeah, we've exchanged a few emails here and there, yeah, and it's,
That's awesome.
I'm like I said, truly, someone who I will, for the rest of my life, think about his impact for sure.
That's great. Sort of around Ripple headquarters, we kind of call those hero glasses, right? When you see the good in other people and you can pull that out of them and you can really support it. It's such a huge value because there are so many. Because I remember you talking about in the book that you were pretty introverted and shy. Just the fact that somebody could recognize that goodness in you, that spark that really lit you up, and look what it did for you. I mean, look where you are today.
Absolutely, and, again, it's like, to do that for no like, he he was a first grade teacher, he wasn't making much money,
Yeah,
and certainly there was no benefit to him to spend all this extra time working on this project with me. He truly just did it out of the goodness of his heart, and again, I always try to remember just how much of an impact that can have on someone and pay it forward as much as I can.
that's awesome. Well, you've had a really interesting career thus far. I mean, you're very diverse in what you do and where you put your time and energy. What's the biggest surprise that you've experienced up to this point? And everything that you are into, obviously with the book and the writing and the podcast, and obviously being a professor. And I mean, you've done so much in a really young life, right? But what's the biggest surprise so far?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think after I wrote my first book, which is about, my sort of faith journey, I kind of got to a point where I thought, oh, this is all I'll ever sort of be able to write about. Because, I came up as a writer, and I talk about this in IRL, the second book. I came up as a writer in the time of like personal branding, quote
Yeah.
unquote, where you have to have this really clearly defined brand, and that is sort of all that you are. And I
Don't
thought,
deviate. Yeah,
right,
that's you.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly, and I felt really restricted by that because, of course, like any person, I have a range of interests and things that and my curiosity as a writer, I always wanna sort of follow my curiosity, and my curiosity, religion will always sort of be in the mix. There's a lot of religion in IRL, but it's not the only thing, and
And
I
it's not
thought,
that overt. I mean, at the end of the day, right? It's,
right.
you utilize it to educate and to tell the stories
Yeah,
really
I'm
well.
thank you. Yeah, no, I'm a religion professor. I'm not, yeah, my goal is never to sort of proselytize about my own view or anyone else's, but rather to sort of look at ways that we have explored these questions historically. But yeah, so I thought, I there was a time when I thought this was all I'll be able to do. Um,
Mhm,
both in terms of what the world might allow me to do and in terms of what I am capable of. And I think the biggest surprise has just been that I have been able to do, as you say, a number of different projects, that, at least on the surface, appear to have nothing to do with each other. A book about the internet, a book about religion, a podcast about loss and grief, and Britney Spears, which you'll have to understand. You'll have to listen to understand how
yeah,
that factors in. Um,
it's a big factor. It's
it
yeah,
is, yeah.
yeah,
But, and again, I think I had this story that I couldn't do that wouldn't be possible.
yeah,
And in many ways, I realized that was a really self-limiting story. It was a story I was telling myself about what I could or couldn't do. And when I sort of decided to take the leap of faith and try to do different things anyway, I found that actually the world was totally willing to embrace different things that I was doing. It was really, I had put my own self in this box, really.
yeah,
So I think that's been the biggest surprise, was that I I think oftentimes, again, like, we tell ourselves a story that kind of holds us back.
yep,
And maybe it's a story that I think it's almost never the case that that's a story we've just invented ourselves. Maybe we heard someone say something to us once, and that kind of then snowballed into this bigger story. I mean, I had publishers, for example, who really wanted me to write another book like my first one and didn't want to take a chance on a really different project. But so it's not as if it was only me holding
yeah.
myself back, but I was my biggest obstacle for sure. And so I
Yeah.
think that's been the biggest surprise for me is that once I kind of took that leap of faith and just kept at it and put the work in, that I was able to make it happen.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you definitely do a great job in that book, for sure. Like I thought, the way that you wove in the stories with the examples and in just the approach that you took really had me intrigued from the very beginning all the way to the end. And, just following you now on social media and kind of seeing what you do and how you live your life, it is this is, from an outsider's perspective, this is someone that you really kind of do have an interest in. You want to see what
Mm,
you're doing because you have that diversity. And so I think that's great that you found that, and kind of was one of the underpinnings of kind of the lessons in the book, right? Is you
uh,
have to look,
yeah,
you have to explore, and you have to not bend to conventional wisdom, in a lot of ways. And you have to be willing to take some chances because that's the only way that you really discover some of the greatness that's out there.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of people who do find that one thing that they want to do for the rest of their lives, and I think that's awesome. And in
Yeah.
many ways, I kind of envy it.
Yeah.
But this class I teach on the search for meaning at Augsburg, it's also on vocation. So we talk a lot about what vocation means, how you sort of determine it, and oftentimes, the sort of most common use of the word vocation is to describe someone's job,
Yeah.
and that is a part of vocation. But I try to sort of encourage my students to think about a vocation more expansively. So it's not just a job you have in a specific moment, it's the way you live your life and how your particular passions or interests intersect with the needs of the world around you. So that can look like lots of things. It can look like how you show up for your family. It can
Yeah.
look like what kinds of businesses you shop at. Like there's a coffee shop in my neighborhood that's worker owned, and I like going there because, versus a sort of big chain, which I go
Yeah.
to big chains for other things, but I really like going to this place knowing I know the people who own it.
Yeah.
I'm friends with them, and it's just so, in general, I think when your sense of sort of who you are is tied up in more than just what you're doing in any given moment in time, your vocation can look like lots of things. Like I help take care of my stepdad, as I write about
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
IRL. And for me, that felt like such an expression of my vocation, of my values, of the ways
Yep.
I'm trying to live my life. And so, I appreciate you saying that. And I think, more and more, especially younger people, are going to have multiple careers. They're going to do different things throughout their lives. And so, as much as you can sort of be open to what new opportunities life might bring your way, to kind of thinking outside the box a little bit, um, I think that that can really lead you in some interesting and surprising directions. Certainly, that's been the case for me, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, so I'd love for my audience to hear your perspective because you do this such a great job in the book talking about this. But, some of the challenges that people often face when they're trying to rectify their, offline, personality and their brand with their online presence, and how that has shifted for a lot of people in terms of what are those boundaries, should there be boundaries, is
Mm,
it, should you have a different persona, whether it's through your gaming or your social platforms or whatever, then how people early on in the internet utilize that as an opportunity to create their own expressionism of who they were at their core that they might not be open to or willing to share with people that they see day to day or their family, et cetera. But that those barriers have changed a lot, right? So how do you view that now, given what you've experienced in writing this book and having the opportunity to promote it?
yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges of the digital age is that we've always been throughout all of human history multiple selves. Like the
Yeah.
person that I am in this conversation is different from the person I am when I'm teaching, or the person I am when I'm with my mom or with my best friends. These are all different parts of me. And it's
Yep.
not that any one of these selves is like fake and there's one that's like the most real. It's that who I am is a composite of all these different selves. I need different parts of my life where I can be different versions of myself in order to feel whole
Yeah.
and complete and real. And the challenge of the internet is that we have to be a single self online for all the different audiences in our lives.
Yeah.
For, I need whoever I share online needs to be able to be seen by my students, by my friends, by my mom, by an employer I might have 20 years from now, and
Yeah.
so as a result, I think we can feel a lot of pressure to try and, simplify ourselves online and reduce ourselves down to a really sort of, safe, quote unquote, version of who we are. But the challenge of that is that we spend more and more of our lives online. So this is a space where we're spending more and more time. And if we don't feel like we can be ourselves there, then it makes us feel like we're not living a real life. And
Yeah.
so, I would say that, well, what I think part of the challenge here is that the internet is so young, and, we're still figuring out kind of how to get our footing in it. And I think, in the future, one of the things I hope we'll get out of living so much of our lives online is we'll just become more comfortable with the fact that as human beings, we do contain multitudes. We
Yeah.
are complicated and contradictory, and that is not, that's not a sign that someone is being fake. It's just part of what it means to be human.
Yeah.
And so hopefully the internet just helps us get more comfortable with that. I also have realized that a lot of people, that basically we we worry a lot more about our own online presentation than other people actually really give much thought to it. So
Yeah.
when I was um, online in the past, I kind of felt like, oh, I need to really stick to my brand, as we were talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then as soon as I started to kind of like loosen the strings a little bit and kind of stop worrying about it so much, I noticed really not much changed. Nobody was like, you're supposed to be this guy. Why are you that now also this guy? Most people were willing to kind of come along for the ride. And I
Yeah.
think, you know, we, again, the internet gives us this opportunity to kind of see different things about ourselves. So if there's something that, for example, I want to post, but then I start to feel like a little uncomfortable, like, should I share this? That's an opportunity to actually sit in that discomfort and ask myself, what is it about this that is making me uncomfortable? What is it
Yeah.
about this that I feel like I couldn't or shouldn't share? And that doesn't mean that you have to share it. I think it's important to have things that are private, that are just for a smaller group of close friends. I don't share every single thought I have on the
Yeah.
internet, but I do think that if you take that moment to be a little more intentional, to ask yourself, what is it about, what I feel like I can or shouldn't share, that is sort of making me uncomfortable? I think that's an opportunity to, learn to recognize things about yourself. And I think the internet can teach us so much about ourselves. And that was really one of the biggest takeaways I got from working on IRL was, wow, what a incredibly powerful tool, powerful in good and bad ways.
Yeah.
And really I need to bring a lot more sort of intention to how I'm using it.
Well, and what you just said, I think is beautifully put, because at the end of the day, when you find yourself in those moments of quandary, right, where you're asking, most people either put it in the drawer and don't think about it again, or they just blast it out there. You need to stop and be, mindful about what's going on, and why are you feeling the way you are, and having that opportunity. Because I think when you look at that, you make a decision one way or the other, right? But that's where the growth is, right? That's the
Hmm.
opportunity, and I think that's super powerful. In fact, I was just doing I might have another podcast called Inquiring Minds that I do with a good friend of mine that's a really well-respected coach up in Canada. And we were just talking about that those are, the opportunities to be in the question in those moments when you
Hmm.
recognize it. Most of us just blow by those things without actually thinking about it. But it's so
Yeah.
powerful when you do, because that's where the growth is.
Especially online, I think,
Yeah.
because as I talk about in IRL, we have been kind of told that the internet isn't real. We've been sort of
Yeah.
encouraged not to think about our digital lives, really, both by the platforms themselves, with which really encourage mindless use. That's kind of a
Yep.
win for the platforms, but also, yeah, we're sort of led to believe that what we do online just like isn't real life. It doesn't count in the same way. And so as a result, we don't really take advantage of the opportunities that it presents us to reflect, to see things in ourselves. And I think as a result, we're missing out on a lot of moments for growth and reflection. So
Well, I also think, some of it, and you talk a lot about this, and one of the topics that I'm very committed to is trying to be as authentic as you are. But, you're authentic today, might be different than your authenticity tomorrow, right? And that's okay, because life has to, and, even the internet has to give you a little bit of, grace and the ability to be that, right? Because we are, like you
absolutely.
said, it's, the multitudes approach, we are different, and we change and we adjust. And but that, when you look into all the opportunities that the internet presents, the opportunity to be there and connect. You mentioned, that sense of belonging, right? It really is the new community. It's the new approach that we can all have, whether it be through Facebook or Twitter or, Instagram, TikTok, wherever we're finding our online community. It's an opportunity for us to belong into a bigger community and conversation. And I'm curious, in terms of your perspective, you mentioned that the internet is still pretty new, right? In the grand scheme of things, where do you see it going in the next 5, 10 years relative to belonging in a community?
Yeah. Well, so I think again, and I talk about this in the book, one of the biggest challenges is that, even though the internet sort of feels like the public square, it's really not. It's private space. It's run
Yep.
by private companies. We've seen a ton of this with what's going on with Twitter right now. And, and so, because of that, the platforms, operate in ultimately in a way that's designed to make money for the people who run them. And that doesn't always sort of help us develop a sense of community.
Yeah.
Often it
Yeah.
can sort of lead us to feel more polarized or more divided. And I think many of us have gone online looking for a sense of connection or belonging and just ended up feeling more disconnected than we
Yeah.
did before. So I think there has to be some change in how the platforms are run themselves, but that doesn't mean that we have no agency at all. It doesn't mean we're completely powerless, because I referenced this in IRL. I found this really helpful study out of BYU. It was this 8-year longitudinal study they did. So they tracked the same people for 8 years, and they found that two people could spend the exact same amount of time online and have radically different
Yeah.
experiences,
Yeah.
and that it all came down to how intentional they were being about what needs they were trying to meet when they went online. So someone who
Yeah.
just went online not really sort of knowing why they were grabbing their phone, they were just sort of reflexively grabbing it and started scrolling, and they got caught up in the algorithm, and then they ended up feeling bad. They ended up
Yeah.
feeling disconnected, lonely, or more isolated, versus someone who went online to say, or thinking to themselves, I'm going on for this reason. I'm
Yeah.
going on because I'm looking to connect in this way, and that sort of thing, was able to have an experience where they felt very connected. And so, again, a lot of it boils down to how kind of self aware are we being about what we're using these digital tools for. So, my hope is that in the future, the platforms will change, but also like that part of how they'll change is actually to invite more mindful use rather than more mindless use.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, though, given that I think that's probably a little ways off, I think trying to cultivate that sense of, sort of mindfulness and self awareness in yourself, I think can make a difference in the meantime.
I think that's excellent advice. I know you're on a short schedule, and I just have a few things that I want to ask you before we wrap up. But I could talk to you for hours on several of these topics. But the one thing that I think you just hit there is being mindful about what your intention is online. And what I actually found, in all honesty, is after I discovered your work, and then the next thing you do with, anybody that you get intrigued by their work, you go and look them up online, and
Hmm.
you find what they're up to in social platforms and whatnot. And I've had a lot of fun following you on Twitter and Instagram. But the genuineness that you bring to the table, I think, is key. And I talk a lot about connection points. You look for things where, even though you and I have never met face to face, and we might not have ever connected had it not been for the opportunity to read your book and to reach out to you to invite you onto the podcast. But connection points, you find those things that mean something to you, like Alex did to you when you first connected with him, and you tell that story and in the podcast. You find things that people are passionate about or what they're into, and you utilize that as the opportunity to have that conversation, and maybe have you back at some point to talk about how that transitions from the online world into the offline world to build those relationships. But thinking about the connection points that I see from you to how I sort of really, it really endeared me to what I wanted to follow and experience what you're up to. Is you're passionate for dogs. I love dogs. They're awesome.
Yeah.
You have these gopher looking things that almost look prehistorically large, but they're awesome, that you've had on your Instagram. But you and I have the Alzheimer's thing in common, right?
Mm.
My mom suffered with it for 10 years. it's a horrible disease to watch. And so, my heartfelt, empathy goes out to you because of what I know you and your mom are going through right now with your stepdad, but how you handled that in the book with the care and compassion you did, and what you're doing today to show up as an authentic, real human, dealing with that as one of the part of the caretaking team, I think is just so amazing. And so, those connection points, those things
Mm.
you learn about people, those become your dialogue jumping off points. Those become your ability to have, conversations and expand that relationship and grow, kind of like Britney Spears did, obviously
Mhm.
for you and Alex and so many
Yeah.
others. I just find that so fascinating that you've hit on it. And even though you didn't use the words that I use, connection points, those really were what you were talking about. Those things that make people really tick, really connect, and really find that thing that makes that relationship possible.
Yeah, I reference in IRL this book called Rising by Elizabeth Rush, that I was reading, and I picked it up because I was kind in 2019, I was kind of going through this period of trying to understand what should I even think about climate change? It's such a huge issue, and how am I supposed to feel about this? And so I was reading all these books, and this book Rising is about the sort of shorelines in the United
Yep.
States, the coastlines, and so I picked it up thinking, oh, I'm going to read this book about climate change. And near the very beginning, she talks about Alzheimer's. And at the time, I was taking care of my stepdad 3 days a week. And so it just immediately jumped out at me, that part of the book. And it ended up staying with me. And it becomes this sort of like core thing in IRL. And
Yeah.
so, like you said, sometimes it's just that little connection point that, it might be this unexpected thing that you're not, you don't sort of anticipate you're going to find in someone's work or in a person that you meet or that sort of thing that can lead to a truly unexpected connection. So I'm glad that, yeah, you were able to find some of those. And I appreciate that we've been able to connect very much.
Absolutely. Well, so I always like to finish this up with a couple of specific Ripple questions. Like I said, I have 3 pages of questions I had for you. So, and I know you're on a
Sure.
limited schedule, but
Sure.
I am so grateful for your time, but I always like to wrap this up with a few Ripple connection questions, that give our audience just a little bit of more insight as to who you are. But, I highly recommend everybody go check out your work because you are amazing. But what do you think the next 5 years look like for you? What would you like them to look like for
Oh
you?
gosh, that's a great question. I think I used to have a real vision of what my future was going to look like, but life has totally like surprised me in all kinds of good and bad ways. And that's been very humbling, I think. And it's helped me recognize that, there's a lot in life that you can't anticipate, you can't prepare for. And yet there's also a lot, like, if you're open to sort of new chapters that can be really beautiful and surprising. And so I think at this point in my life, I'm really just trying to stay open. It's not as if I'm not working toward goals. I definitely have them. I'm about to start work on another book. I have some other projects in the pipeline,
Awesome.
um, but yeah, I mean, I also like truly can't predict where I'll be 5 years from now, and that feels kind of exciting.
Yeah,
So yeah.
that's great. Well, I love that answer. In your opinion, what's the most important thing in life?
Oh gosh, just a small question.
Yeah, just yeah.
um, Honestly,
For you, yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Maybe it's because we've been bouncing this word back and forth for a while, but I really think that connection is the most important thing in life for me
yeah,
anyway. Both connections with other people. I mean, that is truly where I have learned some of the most in my life and where I found the greatest sense of meaning is in connecting with other people, especially honestly, people who are pretty different from me.
yep,
But also, I'm a person who looks for the connections between ideas, between experience, and so for me that like at an intersection, that's like where learning happens. And I even again talk in my class about vocation as this kind of intersection between your own interests and passions, like what gets you out of bed in the morning, and between that and what the world needs.
yeah.
And so for me, those connections, those intersections, those are like, that's where meaning happens in life, whether it's between people or ideas or those kinds of things.
Yeah, and you talk about being introverted. I am painfully introverted and shy, so we have that in common. And when you talk about it as a youth, but it's funny that we both end up in career paths that actually require us to connect and engage because exactly like you said, that's where the magic happens, right? And that's the beautiful thing, and it's probably one of the more inspiring things, obviously. So, what's the best thing you could hear a colleague, student, or friend say about Chris Stedman?
Oh gosh. Um, you know, I
These seem like hard questions. I promise. I'm not trying to no
they
gotchas,
are
but
hard questions. No, but they're also questions I never get asked, which is
yeah,
great. um, gosh, I mean, I'd say it sort of depends on who is speaking. So if it's someone that I know personally, the thing I guess I would want to hear is that you know, I try to be a good friend, a good
yeah,
son, a good neighbor. I definitely wouldn't say I always succeed, but that is my sort of goal in life, is to be there for the people I love in the way that the people I love have so consistently been there for me. And if it's someone who engages with my work, I guess like the main thing, truly the main goal I have in ever publishing anything is that it could be useful to a person. So I just want my work to be able to be useful, to just to
yeah.
be of use. So those are the things I guess I would hope to hear.
Well, I'd say mission accomplished there. I just, I'll go
Oh,
out on a
thanks.
limb and say that for sure. You're definitely doing that. You're making a huge impact in the world. What is your personal secret to success?
Oh, gosh. I I think this is something I wasn't always aware of, but it's been pointed out to me by a number of people in my life, especially over the last few years. But I am truly a very like driven person, and it's not always a good thing. I can kind of get a little bit of tunnel vision sometimes,
Yeah,
like when I'm become super passionate about a project or something. Sometimes it's like all I can think about.
yeah,
um and so i I think for me, the trick to sort of success, whatever that means, is, to like try to harness the innate kind of characteristics I already have for, to kind of further my goals. So again, I'm very driven. So if I tap into that, can help me get things done. I'm very sort of like skeptical or inquisitive or curious, so if I can tap into that, that can help me, get, right, follow my curiosity, etc. But it doesn't mean that you have to have the exact characteristics I have. I think it's just about tapping into whatever your drives are. So like I know someone who is profoundly compassionate and caring and nurturing, and that is just like everything that they do, I can see that coming through.
yeah,
And when they are tapping into that and when they're harnessing that, they're like unstoppable. They might not be like as driven or focused or whatever as I am, but they can do things with that that I could never do. So it really is, I think, just a matter of kind of figuring out what some of your, and it's, I mean, it is tapping into things that you sort of have a natural ability at, but it's also cultivating in maybe the areas where you're not as strong. I have definitely forced myself in moments in my life to kind of step outside of my comfort zone and try to do things that, don't come as naturally to me. I write in IRL about getting involved in cross country in high
yeah.
school, which was the first time really that I did something and pursued something that was something I was like really bad at. And I think that you kind of learn things through that kind of experience as well.
Yeah,
So it's not, but yeah, I would say like for me, what helps me kind of like get to my goals is figuring out, okay, I um I can get really obsessed with things. I talk
yeah,
in IRL about my obsessive compulsive disorder, which I literally, have
yep,
and have had since I was an adolescent. So that's, when it takes the form of my OCD, that's like when it's being maladaptive. It's like it's harmful, it's creating a negative impact on my life.
yeah.
But it's also the same thing, that kind of obsessive curiosity that drives my writing and my, teaching and all that stuff. So, it's a matter of taking those things that, they can either like show up in really negative ways in your life or really positive, and trying to kind of harness the positive expressions of them.
And it's a delicate dance, right?
Yeah, for sure.
For sure. Well,
For sure.
last two questions. What does the ripple effect mean to you?
Well, I think again about the sort of connections. It's like the I don't necessarily know always how what I might sort of do or say to a person might have the effect it might have down the road. Thinking about my first grade teacher, for
Yeah,
example, and how in the moment he could have very easily said, I'm really busy. I'm not getting paid for this. I'm
yeah,
not, whatever. But he went out of his way to do that. And as a result, I have written a couple of books and a
Yeah.
podcast and all this stuff that truly like wouldn't exist probably without, I mean, who knows, other things could have happened in life, but I can draw a direct line from that to where I am today. And so I try to remember that, yeah, we have a responsibility to one another. The ways that we kind of treat each other, the ways that we can go out of our way to kind of n- recognize and name something in somebody else could have an impact that we can't even possibly imagine. So
Yeah.
that's what I would say.
I love that definition. It's right on. It's fantastic. What ripples can I be creating for you?
That's a great question. I mean, I think you already are just by inviting me into this conversation with you. So I'm really grateful for that. And I think connections, they don't just sort of stop and start. So I can only imagine that our paths might cross for any number of other reasons down the road, and I want to be open to that. Just like, again, I think I try to practice this openness to wherever life takes me, and that's part of why I said yes to your invitation. And so who knows, yeah, what where that might lead us down the road.
Well, you're probably stuck with me, so we're gonna have to, figure out how to strike up a friendship for sure. Because I definitely love what you're doing. I love what
Thank
you're
you.
about, all the work that you're doing. Just real quickly, tell our audience how they can, find your book, how you would like them to, find you online and follow you.
Yeah, sure. So you can go to my website. That's got kind of everything right there. It's chrisstedmanwriter.com. So it's ChrisStedman and then the word writer.com. I'm also on, yeah, as you mentioned, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You could find me there. In terms of the book, you can find links to that on my website. Feel free to order it truly from anywhere, although I love to encourage people to support their local bookstore. If you have
Yep.
like an independent bookstore in your town, especially in the sort of pandemic years, a
Yeah.
lot of small businesses have struggled. So I think I always love when people order from their local bookstores if that's possible, but I get it. Sometimes we can't, and that's totally fine. And yeah, if anyone wants to reach out, I always love hearing from people, especially if you check out the book or the podcast and you want to let me know what you thought. I'd love to hear it. So feel free to reach out to me online if you'd like.
Absolutely. Well, in the book, IRL and Faitheist, both links are on your website. And then the podcast, Unread, is on all podcast platforms. So I highly encourage our folks to go out and support Chris, see the work, get the books, check out the podcast, and follow him on those social platforms because you will be a better person because of it. So,
Thank
Chris,
you.
thanks so much for being a part of the Ripple Effect podcast. I really, really do appreciate it. And like I said, you probably can't shake me. So we're gonna have to have another conversation at some point. So
Sounds good. I look forward to it.
all right, man. Well, yeah, I appreciate it. You go out there and have a great rest of your day. And as always, ripple on.
Thanks. You too.